On the night of September 10th, 2001, Sneha and Philip left her apartment in Battery Park City, Manhattan, never imagining she would never return. She was a 31-year-old woman, a doctor, intelligent, with her whole life ahead of her. That night she decided to go shopping, something completely normal, something we all do. She bought lingerie, shoes, and beauty products at Century 21, a department store just a few blocks from her home. Security cameras captured her leaving the store at 10 p.m. with her bags in hand. And that's where all trace of her ends. What makes this case absolutely unique and heartbreaking is that the next day, September 11th, 2001, something happened that would change the world forever. And Sneha's disappearance was buried under the rubble of one of the greatest tragedies in modern history. Did she die in the terrorist attacks? Or did something happen to her the night before? That question has haunted her family for more than 2 decades. Sneha Philip was not an ordinary person. Born in India, she had immigrated to the United States with her family as a child. She was brilliant, dedicated, a physician working in internal medicine at a New York hospital. Everyone spoke of her compassion, her commitment to helping others. But Sneha also had another side, a darker, more complicated one. In the months before her disappearance, her professional and personal life was in free fall. She had been fired from 2 consecutive jobs due to alcohol problems. Her marriage to Ron, her husband, was completely fractured. There were rumors that Sneha had extramarital relationships with both men and women. On the night of September 10th, she had a heated argument with Ron. That argument would be the last conversation anyone in her family would have with her. And what no one knew was that the purchases she made that night contained a detail that would completely change the narrative of her disappearance. Before continuing, I want to ask you, where are you listening to me from right now and what time is it there? Leave it in the comments. I'm fascinated to know that you're joining me from different corners of the world. And if this story is capturing you as much as it is me, please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and turn on notifications because this mystery has twists you won't expect. Now, let's continue. On September 10th, Sneha had spent the day alone. Her husband Ron was working. She had been suspended from her job at the hospital just days before, so she was technically on leave. Around 4 p.m., Sneha called her mother to talk briefly. Nothing in that conversation suggested anything was wrong. Then, around 6 p.m., she left her apartment. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. She didn't leave any note. She simply took her wallet and left. Security footage from the building shows her leaving, dressed casually but put together. She walked toward the World Trade Center area, where the Century 21 store was located. She entered the store around 7:30 p.m. and was there for almost 2.5 hours trying on clothes, looking at products. Finally, at 10 p.m., she purchased several items and left. The cameras captured her walking through the streets of Manhattan with her bags. And after that, nothing. Absolutely nothing. Ron Lieberman, Sneha's husband, arrived home late that night, around midnight. He didn't see Sneha, but it didn't worry him too much either. Their relationship was tense, and it was common for them to spend time apart. He assumed she was with a friend or would arrive later. He went to sleep. The next morning, September 11th, Ron woke up early to go to work. Sneha still hadn't appeared, but he thought maybe she had spent the night out. It wouldn't be the first time. He left his apartment located in Battery Park City, just a few blocks from the World Trade Center. While he was on the subway on his way to work, the unthinkable happened. The first plane hit the North Tower at 8:46 a.m. Ron, like millions of people, was in shock. He immediately thought of Sneha. Had she gone to work that morning? Was she near the towers? He tried calling her over and over again. Nothing. Her phone had no signal. In the midst of the absolute chaos that broke out in New York that day, Ron desperately tried to locate Sneha. He called friends, family, hospitals. No one had seen her. No one knew anything. Sneha's family also began frantically searching for her. Her brother went to her apartment, but it was empty. Sneha's keys were in the apartment, which was strange. Her documents, her passport, everything was still there. The only things missing were her and the shopping bags she had carried the night before. In the middle of the greatest tragedy the United States had experienced, with nearly 3,000 people dead or missing, Sneha Philip became a case within a catastrophe. Investigators didn't know whether to include her on the list of September 11th victims or treat her as an unrelated missing person. And here began the debate that would last for years. Where was Sneha from 10 p.m. on September 10th until the morning of September 11th? Those lost hours are the key to everything. Sneha's family, especially her husband Ron, proposed a theory that quickly gained traction. According to them, Sneha, being a doctor and having a compassionate heart, would have run toward the Twin Towers when the attacks occurred to help the victims. This theory painted Sneha as a hero, someone who in the moment of greatest need left everything to save lives. Ron argued that she was probably in the area, saw the smoke, heard the chaos, and her medical instincts led her straight to ground zero. Once there, she could have been trapped in the collapse of the towers. This narrative was beautiful, noble, and gave meaningful closure to an incomprehensible disappearance. The media adopted it. Sneha was portrayed as one of the heroic victims of 9/11. But there was a huge problem with this theory. There was absolutely no evidence that Sneha had been near the towers that morning. No witness saw her. No camera captured her. And most importantly, none of her colleagues or acquaintances placed her there. When investigators reviewed what Sneha had purchased at Century 21 that last night, they found something that made the Good Samaritan theory sound less credible. Sneha had bought lingerie, dress shoes, and beauty products. These weren't purchases someone makes before going home to sleep. These were purchases someone makes when they have plans for that night. Plans with whom? That was the question. Investigators began to suspect that Sneha had not returned to her apartment that night of September 10th, that she had spent the night elsewhere with someone else, and that perhaps what happened to her had nothing to do with the terrorist attacks the next day. This theory was supported by the fact that Sneha had been involved in multiple romantic affairs outside her marriage. She had been going out with both men and women in the previous months. Some of these encounters had occurred in bars and clubs in Manhattan. Is it possible that she met someone that night? That she went to that person's apartment? And that something went terribly wrong? Ron returned to his apartment days after September 11th, once the city began to calm down a bit. He desperately searched for any clue about where Sneha might be. And that's when he noticed something crucial. The shopping bags Sneha had carried that night were not in the apartment. Neither were the clothes she had bought. If Sneha had returned to the apartment that night, where were her purchases? Ron argued that perhaps she had left the bags somewhere else before running to the towers. But investigators weren't convinced. It was also discovered that the building's card access system did not register any entry by Sneha after she left on September 10th. This was significant because every time someone entered the building, an electronic record was kept. Sneha's last record was from when she left at 6 p.m. There was no record of her coming back. This strongly suggested that Sneha never returned home that night. As investigators delved deeper into Sneha's life, they discovered a woman completely different from the public image she projected. Sneha frequented lesbian bars in Greenwich Village. She had had several relationships with women, some of them serious. She had also been involved with men outside her marriage. Her alcohol consumption had escalated dramatically in recent months. She had been seen several times intoxicated in public places. Her colleagues at the hospital had reported that she was late, sometimes smelled of alcohol, and her performance had decreased considerably. All this had culminated in her dismissal. Ron knew about some of these problems, but not the full extent. When the truth came out during the investigation, many began to question whether they really knew Sneha. Was it possible that on the night of September 10th, she had gone to meet someone she knew from the nightlife scene? Someone dangerous? Investigators tracked down several people Sneha had been involved with. All were questioned. None admitted to having seen her that night. In 2004, 3 years after Sneha's disappearance, her family filed a petition for her to be officially declared a victim of September 11th. This would allow them to receive compensation from the Victim Compensation Fund. But the case wasn't that simple. The New York City medical examiner rejected the petition, arguing there was insufficient evidence that Sneha had been near the towers when they collapsed. The family appealed. A legal battle began that would last for years. The family's lawyers presented evidence that Sneha was a compassionate person, that her medical instincts would have led her to help. They presented testimony from people who knew her. But the opposition argued that Sneha's recent history, her personal problems, and the fact that she never returned home on the night of September 10th suggested that something completely unrelated to the terrorist attacks had happened to her. The debate became very public, very painful for the family. Sneha was being judged posthumously, her private life exposed for everyone to see. If you still haven't subscribed to the channel, do it now. This case gets more and more complex, and you need to be here for the ending. Give it a like, turn on notifications, and share with someone who loves real mysteries. In the midst of all this controversy, a witness appeared who would change everything. A person claimed to have seen Sneha on the morning of September 11th, walking toward the Twin Towers with what appeared to be medical equipment. This testimony came years after the attacks and could never be completely verified. The alleged witness described a woman matching Sneha's appearance, walking hurriedly toward the World Trade Center area around 9 a.m. They said the woman seemed determined, focused. The family clung to this testimony as proof that Sneha had been there, that she had died as a hero. But investigators had doubts. Why did this witness wait so long to come forward? Why hadn't they reported this immediately after the attacks? Was it a real memory or something constructed over time? Human memory is notoriously unreliable, especially after traumatic events. It's possible this witness genuinely believed they saw Sneha, but it was actually someone else. Or worse yet, that it was completely fabricated. After years of legal battle, finally in 2008, a judge made a decision. He declared that Sneha Philip should be officially considered a victim of September 11th. The judge based his decision on the fact that there was no conclusive evidence that something had happened to her before the attacks, and that given her profession and personality, it was reasonable to conclude she would have responded to the emergency. This decision was celebrated by the family as vindication. Finally, Sneha would be remembered as a hero, but for investigators and many observers, the case remained unresolved. The legal ruling didn't answer the fundamental question. Where was Sneha from 10 p.m. on September 10th until the morning of September 11th? And what really happened to her? The legal ruling gave administrative closure, but didn't give real answers. And there's something deeply unsatisfying about that, because the truth is that no one knows for certain what happened to Sneha Philip. There's another theory, darker, that some private investigators have explored. This theory suggests that Sneha was the victim of a crime of passion on the night of September 10th. Given her history of complicated relationships and turbulent personal life, it's possible she met someone that night, there was an argument, and things got out of control. Perhaps that person killed her accidentally or intentionally. And then, when the September 11th attacks occurred the next day, that person saw the perfect opportunity to dispose of the body. With thousands of people dead and missing, with absolute chaos in the city, who would notice one more body? It's a macabre theory, but it's not impossible. In fact, several similar cases have been documented throughout history, where criminals have used natural disasters or mass tragedies to cover up crimes. If this is what happened, Sneha's body could be anywhere. Could have been left in the ground zero area, where it would be impossible to identify among the rubble. Or it could be buried somewhere completely different. Ron Lieberman, Sneha's husband, has maintained a relatively low profile over the years. After the 2008 court ruling, he gave some interviews where he talked about his wife and his belief that she died helping others. But there are those who have pointed out inconsistencies in his statements over the years. Initially, Ron said their marriage was solid. Then he admitted they had problems. First he said he didn't know about Sneha's affairs. Later he admitted he had suspicions. Does this mean Ron is hiding something? Not necessarily. It's completely understandable that someone in his position, dealing with such traumatic loss and under public scrutiny, might have difficulty being completely transparent. Also, no one wants to publicly admit their marriage was fractured. especially when your wife has been declared a national hero. But these inconsistencies have led some to speculate. Is it possible Ron knew more than he said? That maybe Sneha told him where she was going that night and he concealed it? The police investigated him extensively and never found any evidence he was involved in Sneha's disappearance. What makes Sneha's case particularly complex is that she wasn't the only person who disappeared around September 11th under questionable circumstances. There were several other cases of people who disappeared days before or after the attacks, and whose cases became intertwined with the tragedy. Some of these cases were eventually resolved. Bodies were found, circumstances clarified, but others, like Sneha's, remain in limbo. The problem is that September 11th created a massive blind spot in criminal investigation. With thousands of detectives, officers, and resources focused on the terrorist attacks and their aftermath, other crimes didn't receive the attention they normally would have. If someone disappeared or was murdered in New York around those dates, their case probably wasn't investigated with the usual rigor. And if the body never appeared, it's very possible that case will never be solved. Sneha may have been a victim of this perfect storm of circumstances. Over the years, several leads have emerged that seemed promising but ultimately led nowhere. In 2006, someone reported seeing a woman who looked like Sneha in another state. Police investigated, but it turned out to be a case of mistaken identity. In 2010, an unidentified woman turned up dead in another city. For a moment, it was thought it might be Sneha. DNA tests confirmed it wasn't. There have been occasional reports of people claiming to have seen Sneha in different parts of the country, even outside the United States. Each of these reports was investigated. None have been confirmed. It's frustrating, it's exhausting, it's devastating for the family. Every time a new lead emerges, there's a flash of hope, and every time it fades, the pain is renewed. After more than 20 years, the chances of finding Sneha alive are virtually nil. But without a body, without concrete evidence, it's impossible to know for certain what happened to her. The fact that Sneha was officially declared a victim of September 11th has been controversial from the beginning. There are those who firmly believe she was in the towers, that she died helping others, and that she deserves to be honored as a hero. But there are others who argue this is a distortion of the truth, that there's no real evidence she was there, and that her inclusion on the victim list minimizes those who definitely died in the attacks. This debate touches sensitive nerves. On one hand, we understand the family's desire to find meaning in such an incomprehensible loss. It's comforting to think Sneha died saving lives rather than having been a victim of a violent crime or her own decisions. On the other hand, truth matters. And the truth is we don't know what happened to Sneha. Declaring her a hero based on assumptions and not facts can be problematic. Where do we draw the line? How much evidence do we need before making claims about what happened to someone? It's a difficult question without an easy answer. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already, give this video a like, and turn on notifications. We're reaching the end of this story and you won't want to miss the conclusions. Sneha's family has spent more than 2 decades without answers. Her mother, her siblings, all have had to learn to live with uncertainty. They couldn't have a traditional funeral because there was no body to bury. They couldn't have closure because they don't know what happened. Grief without closure is one of the most painful experiences a human being can experience. It's called ambiguous loss, and it's psychologically devastating. The human mind needs closure, needs to know, needs to understand. When that's not available, the pain becomes chronic. Sneha's family has talked about how every September 11th is a painful reminder. While the country commemorates the victims of the terrorist attacks, they commemorate Sneha without really knowing if she died that day or not. They've created memorials, they've shared memories, they've kept her memory alive. But deep down, there will probably always be a part of them wondering, what really happened that night of September 10th? Sneha Phillips' case teaches us several important things. First, it shows us how a massive tragedy can complicate or even bury individual cases. The September 11th attacks were so devastating that many other mysteries went unsolved. Second, it reminds us that people are complex. Sneha wasn't just a dedicated physician or just a woman with problems. She was both. She was human with virtues and flaws. Judging her one way or the other is to simplify a life that was much more complicated. Third, this case illustrates the dangers of building narratives without sufficient evidence. The story of Sneha as a 9/11 hero is beautiful, but it may not be true. And when we privilege the comforting narrative over the facts, we move away from the truth. Finally, the case shows us the importance of never forgetting the missing. Even when cases go cold, even when decades pass, these people deserve to be remembered and their cases deserve attention. Because every missing person is someone who was loved, who had dreams, who mattered.
Enterrar. No pudieron tener un cierre porque no saben qué pasó. El duelo sin cierre es una de las experiencias más dolorosas que un ser humano puede experimentar. Se llama pérdida ambigua y es psicológicamente devastador. La mente humana necesita cierre, necesita saber, necesita entender. Cuando eso no está disponible, el dolor se vuelve crónico. La familia de Sneha ha hablado sobre cómo cada 11 de septiembre es un recordatorio doloroso. Mientras el país conmemora a las víctimas de los ataques terroristas, ellos conmemoran a Sneha sin saber realmente si murió ese día o no. Han creado memoriales, han compartido recuerdos, han mantenido viva su memoria. Pero en el fondo, probablemente siempre habrá una parte de ellos que se pregunte, ¿qué pasó realmente esa noche del 10 de septiembre? El caso de Sneha Philip nos enseña varias cosas importantes. Primero, nos muestra cómo una tragedia masiva puede complicar o incluso enterrar casos individuales. Los ataques del 11 de septiembre fueron tan devastadores que muchos otros misterios quedaron sin resolver. Segundo, nos recuerda que las personas son complejas. Sneha no era solo una médica dedicada o solo una mujer con problemas. Era ambas cosas. Era humana, con virtudes y defectos. Juzgarla en un sentido u otro es simplificar una vida que era mucho más complicada. Tercero, este caso ilustra los peligros de construir narrativas sin evidencia suficiente. La historia de Sneha como heroína del 11/S es hermosa, pero puede no ser verdad. Y cuando privilegiamos la narrativa reconfortante sobre los hechos, nos alejamos de la verdad. Finalmente, el caso nos muestra la importancia de nunca olvidar a los desaparecidos. Incluso cuando los casos se vuelven fríos, incluso cuando pasan décadas, estas personas merecen ser recordadas y sus casos merecen atención. Porque cada persona desaparecida es alguien que fue amado, que tuvo sueños, que importó. Más de 20 años después, la desaparición de Sneha Philip sigue siendo un misterio completo. No hay cuerpo, no hay escena del crimen, no hay sospechosos confirmados. Lo único que tenemos son teorías, especulaciones y una enorme cantidad de preguntas sin respuesta. ¿Murió en los ataques del 11 de septiembre? Es posible, pero no hay evidencia. ¿Fue víctima de un crimen la noche anterior? También es posible, e incluso probable según algunos investigadores. ¿Desapareció voluntariamente? Extremadamente improbable, pero no imposible. La verdad es que probablemente nunca lo sabremos. A menos que alguien que sepa algo decida hablar, a menos que aparezca evidencia nueva, este caso permanecerá sin resolver para siempre. Y eso es profundamente insatisfactorio. Nos gusta pensar que todos los misterios pueden ser resueltos, que la verdad siempre sale a la luz. Pero la realidad es que hay casos que permanecen abiertos, preguntas que quedan sin respuesta, familias que nunca obtienen el cierre que merecen. Sneha Philip es uno de esos casos. Una mujer que salió a comprar ropa una noche de septiembre y nunca regresó. Una vida llena de complejidad, de contradicciones, de humanidad. Y un final que nadie conoce. Si este caso te impactó, si te hizo pensar, si te dejó con más preguntas que respuestas, déjame saber en los comentarios qué teoría crees que es más probable. ¿Heroína del 11/S? ¿Víctima de un crimen? ¿Algo completamente diferente? No olvides suscribirte al canal, darle like a este video, compartirlo con alguien que ame los misterios reales y activar las notificaciones para más casos que te mantendrán despierto por la noche. Nos vemos en el próximo misterio.
It's March 31st, 2006. A Friday night in Columbus, Ohio. Spring break is in full swing, and the bars near Ohio State University are packed with college students celebrating. Among them is Brian Schaefer, a second-year medical student who has every reason to be looking forward to the future. He's smart, well-liked, and just a week away from a vacation to Miami with his girlfriend. But Brian Schaefer will never make it to that trip. Because tonight, he's going to walk into a bar and never walk out. What makes Brian's disappearance so haunting isn't just that he vanished. It's that he vanished from a place with only one exit, covered by security cameras that recorded everyone who entered and left that night. Everyone except Brian. The footage shows him walking into the Ugly Tuna Saloon bar at 1:15 a.m. It never shows him leaving. And despite one of the most extensive investigations in Ohio history, no one has ever figured out how he simply ceased to exist. This is a story that defends logic and challenges everything we think we know about how people disappear. It's a case that has haunted investigators, tormented a family, and spawned countless theories ranging from the plausible to the impossible. And it all begins with a night that started like any other college evening but ended with a mystery that remains unsolved nearly 2 decades later. Before we dive deeper into what happened that night, if you're finding this story compelling, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Share this with anyone who's fascinated by true mysteries. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Your engagement helps us bring more cases like this to light. Now let's continue with the events that led to one of America's most baffling disappearances. Brian Schaefer was 27 years old in March 2006. He wasn't your typical medical student burning out from stress. By all accounts, he was handling the pressure well, maintaining good grades while still finding time for a social life. He had a close relationship with his girlfriend, Alexis Wagoner, and they were planning their future together. He was close with his father, Randy, especially after the devastating loss of his mother to cancer just weeks earlier. Brian was grieving, certainly, but he was coping. He was moving forward. Or at least he was trying to. That Friday night, Brian met up with his friend William, Clint, Florence. They planned to hit a few bars in the South Campus Gateway area, the kind of night out that thousands of college students have without incident. They started at a bar called the Ugly Tuna Saloon, located on the second floor of a Gateway complex. The bar was crowded, music was loud, and Brian seemed to be in good spirits despite the recent loss of his mother. Security cameras captured him entering the bar, laughing with Clint, ordering drinks, talking to women. Everything appeared normal. Around 1:55 a.m., the cameras caught what would become the last verified footage of Brian Schaefer. He's visible talking to 2 young women near the bar's entrance. He's animated, smiling, gesturing as he speaks. Then he turns, appears to say something to the women, and moves back toward the interior of the bar. The camera loses sight of him. And that's it. That's the last time anyone can definitively prove Brian Schaefer existed. When the bar closed at 2 a.m., Clint couldn't find Brian. He assumed his friend had left early, maybe met someone, maybe just decided to call it a night. Clint went home. He wasn't worried. Why would he be? People split up at bars all the time. But Brian never came home. His girlfriend couldn't reach him. His father heard nothing. And when Brian didn't show up for work on Monday, people started to realize that something was very, very wrong. The police investigation began almost immediately, and what they discovered would baffle them for years to come. The Ugly Tuna Saloon had only one public entrance and exit, a single doorway accessed by an escalator. That doorway was covered by a security camera that recorded everyone who entered and exited the bar that night. Investigators reviewed every second of that footage. They could see Brian entering. They could see Clint leaving. They could see dozens of other patrons coming and going. But nowhere, in hours of footage, could they see Brian Schaefer leaving. It's physically impossible, and yet it happened. A grown man entered a building and never came out, despite the fact that every exit was monitored. This is the core mystery that has defined the case for 18 years. Because if Brian didn't leave through the door, where did he go? And more importantly, how did he vanish so completely that despite massive searches, psychic consultations, and FBI involvement, not a single trace of him has ever been found? When Brian's father, Randy Schaefer, reported his son missing on April 3, the Columbus Police Department initially treated it as a standard missing persons case. A young man in his 20s fails to come home after a night of drinking. It happened regularly. Most of these cases resolved within days when the person turned up hungover at a friend's house or sleeping off a bender somewhere. But Randy knew his son. Brian was responsible. He had work commitments. He had that Miami trip planned. He wouldn't just vanish without a word. The first thing investigators did was review the security footage from the Ugly Tuna Saloon, and that's when they encountered the first major problem. Brian was clearly visible entering the bar at 1:15 a.m. Multiple cameras inside the bar showed him drinking, socializing, and appearing to have a good time. But when they reviewed the footage from the entrance camera, tracking every person who left between 1:15 a.m. and closing time at 2 a.m., Brian wasn't among them. He simply wasn't there. The police considered every possibility. Maybe he left during a gap in the footage? There were no gaps. The cameras ran continuously. Maybe he disguised himself somehow. They looked for anyone leaving who could possibly be Brian in different clothes or a hat. No matches. Maybe he left with a group and the camera angle obscured him. They tracked every group that left, identifying each individual. Brian wasn't among them. Maybe the timestamp was wrong. They verified the footage against other cameras in the area. The time was accurate. Detective John Hurst, who led the investigation, would later describe the footage analysis as one of the most frustrating experiences of his career. He knew what he was seeing made no logical sense. A person cannot enter a building through a single monitored entrance and then fail to exit through that same entrance without being recorded. It violated basic physical law. Yet that appeared to be exactly what happened. And the more they examined the footage, the more impossible it became. The police expanded their investigation. They interviewed everyone who had been at the Ugly Tuna that night. They talked to the two women Brian was seen speaking with in his last recorded moments. The women said Brian had been friendly, perhaps a bit drunk, but not stumbling or incoherent. He'd asked about their evening, made some jokes, and then excused himself to find his friend. They assumed he'd left with Clint. They didn't see anything suspicious. Clint Florence, Brian's friend who had been with him that night, became a person of interest simply by proximity. He was the last known person to see Brian. Police questioned him extensively. Clint's story never changed. They'd been bar hopping, ended up at Ugly Tuna. Brian was drinking but not excessively. They separated inside the bar, and Clint assumed Brian had left when he couldn't find him at closing time. Clint took a polygraph test. He passed. Investigators found no evidence suggesting he knew anything about Brian's disappearance. Then police considered the building itself. The Ugly Tuna Saloon was on the second floor of a complex. The main entrance was the only public way in or out. But there were service entrances, a loading dock, areas used by staff. Could Brian have left through one of those? They were all either locked, alarmed, or led to areas that would have required Brian to navigate through restricted spaces, down service corridors, past staff. The bar employees insisted no patron could have used those exits without being noticed. Still, investigators searched every inch of the building. They brought in cadaver dogs. They checked the roof access, the ventilation systems, storage areas, even the garbage chutes. They found nothing. No signs of struggle. No blood. No indication Brian had ever been in any area outside the public bar space. It was as if he had literally evaporated into thin air somewhere between the camera losing sight of him at 1:55 a.m. and the bar closing 5 minutes later. The police also investigated Brian's personal life, looking for any reason he might have chosen to disappear. They examined his bank accounts. No unusual transactions. They checked his credit cards. No activity after March 31st. They pulled his phone records. The last call was made that evening before he went to the bar. They interviewed his girlfriend, Alexis. She was distraught, insistent that Brian would never leave voluntarily, especially not without telling her. Their relationship was strong. They were planning a future together. They talked to Brian's father, Randy, who was equally adamant. Yes, Brian had been grieving his mother's recent death. Yes, he'd been under stress from medical school. But Randy had seen his son regularly in the weeks before the disappearance. Brian was sad, certainly, but he was functioning. He was looking forward to the Miami trip. He was engaged with his studies. There were no signs of suicidal ideation, no indication he was planning to walk away from his life. The investigation broadened. Police canvassed the area around the South Campus Gateway. They talked to homeless individuals who frequented the area, thinking maybe someone had seen Brian leaving on foot. They reviewed footage from other cameras in the vicinity, trying to track where he might have gone if he had somehow left the building undetected. They found nothing. Brian Schaefer had effectively vanished from existence the moment the ugly tuna camera lost sight of him. As days turned into weeks, the case attracted media attention. Local news ran stories about the missing medical student. Brian's picture was everywhere. Tips started coming in. Someone thought they saw Brian at a rest stop. Someone else was sure they'd seen him at a concert. Every lead was investigated. Every sighting was tracked down. None of them panned out. The person at the rest stop was someone else. The guy at the concert looked nothing like Brian up close. The tips led nowhere. The Columbus Police Department brought in FBI assistance. Federal investigators reviewed the case files, examined the evidence, and reached the same frustrating conclusion. Brian Schaefer had entered the ugly tuna saloon and never left, which was impossible, which meant they were missing something crucial. But what? What were they not seeing? What piece of the puzzle would make this make sense? 1 month after the disappearance, police held a press conference. They asked anyone with information to come forward. They emphasized that Brian's family just wanted to know he was safe. If he had chosen to disappear, they respected that, but please, just let someone know you're alive. The plea went unanswered. Brian's phone never pinged another cell tower. His bank accounts remained untouched. His social security number was never used again. It was as if Brian Schaefer had been erased from the world. When the conventional investigation failed to produce answers, people began developing theories. Some were logical extensions of the known facts. Others ventured into territory that seemed to defy possibility. But in a case where a man vanished from a building he never left, maybe impossible theories deserved consideration. After all, something impossible had clearly happened. The first and most straightforward theory was that Brian left the bar through an exit that investigators hadn't properly considered. Perhaps there was a service entrance they'd overlooked. Maybe he'd convinced a staff member to let him out a back way. This theory had appeal because it didn't require anything supernatural or even particularly unusual. Just a missed detail. A door someone forgot to mention. But extensive searches of the building never revealed such an exit. Every door was accounted for. Every possible route out was monitored or secured. A variation of this theory suggested Brian left the bar in disguise. Maybe he swapped clothes with someone in the bathroom. Put on a hat, borrowed a jacket, walked out looking different enough that investigators didn't recognize him in the footage. But this theory requires believing Brian planned to disappear, which contradicted everything known about his life. His upcoming trip, his relationship, his career plans. Why would someone meticulously planning their disappearance then get drunk at a bar with a friend? Why risk being seen by dozens of witnesses? Some theorized that Brian had met with foul play inside the bar itself. Perhaps someone drugged him, incapacitated him, and smuggled his body out during the chaos of closing time. Maybe staff were involved, helping to conceal what happened. But again, this ran into the camera problem. Every person who left was recorded. Unless Brian's body was somehow hidden in a way that made it invisible to cameras and then removed during daylight hours, which seemed impossibly risky and complicated. The construction theory gained some traction for a while. The South Campus Gateway was undergoing renovation in 2006. There were construction areas, scaffolding, sections being remodeled. Some people suggested Brian might have wandered into a construction zone, had an accident, and his body was somehow sealed behind new drywall or concrete. This theory led to searches using ground-penetrating radar. They found nothing. And it still didn't explain how Brian accessed a construction area without being seen leaving the bar. Then there were the darker theories. That Brian had been targeted by someone, perhaps a serial killer who had been watching the bar. That he'd been lured away by someone he met, someone charismatic enough to convince him to leave through an unconventional exit. That something had happened in those final 5 minutes before the bar closed, something violent and quick, and the perpetrator had managed to conceal both the crime and the body with extraordinary efficiency. Some people looked at Brian's recent history and developed psychological theories. His mother had died just weeks before from cancer. Brian had been close to her. Maybe the grief was deeper than anyone realized. Maybe on that Friday night, after drinks lowered his inhibitions, Brian made a split-second decision to walk away from his life. To start over somewhere new where the pain of loss wasn't so overwhelming. But this theory struggled to explain the logistics. How did he leave the bar? Where did he go with no money, no car, no identification that was ever used again? The suicide theory was perhaps the saddest. That Brian, struggling with grief and the pressure of medical school, decided to end his life. That he somehow left the bar undetected and went somewhere to die, somewhere his body has never been discovered. Columbus has rivers. There are woods. There are places a person could disappear. But again, how did he leave the building? And why has no trace of him ever surfaced in 18 years? Bodies don't stay hidden forever, especially in populated areas. As the investigation dragged on with no breaks, some people began entertaining genuinely bizarre theories. That Brian had been abducted by a human trafficking ring. That he'd witnessed something criminal and been silenced. That he'd somehow gotten involved with dangerous people and been killed. But these theories all suffered from the same fundamental problem. They couldn't explain the central mystery. How did Brian Shaffer leave a building that he was never recorded leaving? One theory that investigators took seriously involved the possibility of Brian being in the witness protection program. Maybe he'd seen something, knew something, and federal agents had whisked him away that night for his own safety. It would explain the complete disappearance, the lack of any trace. But when police reached out to federal authorities, they were told there was no record of Brian Shaffer being in any protection program. It was a dead end. The band theory emerged from a strange detail. A week after Brian disappeared, his girlfriend Alexis received a call from his cell phone. She answered, but there was only static and background noise that sounded like music. The call disconnected after a few seconds. When police traced it, the call had come from Brian's phone, but the location couldn't be pinpointed. Some people theorized Brian was alive, possibly held against his will, trying to reach out. Others thought it was a technical glitch or someone who'd found Brian's phone. The call was never explained, and it never happened again. As the first anniversary of Brian's disappearance approached, his father Randy remained convinced that Brian was alive somewhere. He hired private investigators. He consulted psychics. He followed every lead, no matter how implausible. Randy's faith that his son would come home never wavered, even as the evidence suggested that Brian Schaefer was most likely dead. Whether from an accident, foul play, or suicide, the complete absence of any trace strongly indicated that Brian was gone. But the question remained. Where? Where was the body? Where was the evidence? In a modern American city with surveillance cameras, cell phone towers, and millions of people, how does a person vanish so completely? The theories multiplied, each trying to answer the impossible question. And none of them could fully explain what happened to Brian Schaefer on March 31, 2006. As the investigation progressed, attention inevitably turned to those closest to Brian. In missing persons cases, investigators always look at intimate relationships first. Statistically, if someone is murdered, there's a high probability the perpetrator is someone they knew well. So Alexis Waggoner, Brian's girlfriend, found herself under scrutiny she never expected and never fully escaped. Alexis and Brian had been dating for several years. By all accounts, their relationship was stable and loving. They'd met at Ohio State, bonded over shared interests, and built a life together. They talked about marriage. They planned futures. The Miami trip they were supposed to take in April was intended to be romantic, a chance to reconnect after the difficult period following his mother's death. Alexis appeared genuinely devastated when Brian vanished. Her grief seemed authentic. And yet, investigators had to ask the hard questions. Where was she the night Brian disappeared? Home, she said, sleeping. Did anyone verify that? No, she lived alone. Had they fought recently? They'd had minor disagreements, but nothing serious. Was the relationship in trouble? Not at all, they were closer than ever. Did she have any idea where Brian might have gone? None. Would he have left voluntarily? Never. She was adamant about that. Alexis cooperated with the investigation fully. She provided access to her phone records, her emails, her financial information. She sat for multiple interviews. She took a polygraph test and passed. By every measurable standard, she was a grieving girlfriend desperate for answers. But in the true crime community, and in certain investigative circles, suspicion lingered. Not because of evidence, but because of that statistical reality. When people disappear, loved ones are often involved. Some people pointed to small inconsistencies in her statements. Details that changed slightly between interviews, though nothing that seemed deliberately deceptive, more like the natural variation in how people recall events under stress. Others noted that she seemed to move on with her life relatively quickly. Within a year, she was dating someone new. Within 2 years, she'd married. To some, this suggested she knew Brian wasn't coming back. To others, it was simply a young woman trying to heal from trauma and build a future. The harshest critics noted that Alexis eventually stopped cooperating with investigators. Years into the case, she declined interviews. She refused to meet with new detectives reviewing the case. She moved on with her life and made it clear she wanted to leave the past behind. Some saw this as suspicious. If you truly wanted answers about your missing boyfriend, wouldn't you cooperate forever? But others understood it as self-preservation. How many times can you relive the worst moment of your life for investigators who never find answers? There's a particularly painful detail that fed suspicion. Brian's father, Randy, reportedly had a difficult relationship with Alexis after Brian's disappearance. Randy believed she knew more than she was saying. He never accused her directly of involvement, but he made it known that he questioned her version of events. This family tension added fuel to public speculation. If Brian's own father had doubts, didn't that mean something? But here's what the evidence actually shows. There is nothing linking Alexis to Brian's disappearance. No forensic evidence, no witnesses placing her at the scene. No financial motive. No history of violence in their relationship. No documented fights on the night he vanished. The polygraph she passed asked direct questions about her involvement, and the examiner found no deception. By every objective measure, Alexis Wagoner was exactly what she appeared to be. A girlfriend who lost someone she loved to inexplicable circumstances. The phone call from Brian's cell phone a week after he disappeared added another layer. When Alexis answered and heard only static and music, some people saw it as evidence Brian was alive and trying to reach her. Others suggested maybe Alexis knew where Brian's phone was because she knew where Brian was. But the call was traced and found to have originated from an area near the bar, not from Alexis's location. It proved nothing except that Brian's phone was still on, still capable of making calls, and in someone's possession. What makes Alexis's situation particularly tragic is that she became a suspect in the court of public opinion without any real evidence supporting that suspicion. She was guilty of nothing more than being the girlfriend of a man who vanished. And because the case remained unsolved, because no other clear suspect emerged, that association became permanent. To this day, discussions of Brian Schaefer's disappearance include speculation about Alexis, theories about what she might know, questions about why she stopped cooperating. The reality is probably much simpler and sadder. Alexis Wagoner was a young woman who lost her boyfriend to circumstances she didn't understand. She cooperated with investigators until it became clear they had no answers. She grieved. She moved on because that's what humans do when faced with unresolvable loss. And she chose to build a new life rather than remain frozen in the trauma of March 2006. That's not suspicious. That's survival. The attention on Alexis reflects a broader truth about unsolved cases. When conventional investigation fails, people look for someone to blame. They need the mystery to have a solution, even if that solution is based more on speculation than evidence. Alexis became a convenient target for that need. But being convenient doesn't make it true. And unless new evidence emerges, the most logical conclusion is that Alexis Wagoner is simply another victim of Brian Schaefer's disappearance. Not a perpetrator. A victim who lost someone she loved and then had to endure years of suspicion for a crime no one can prove even happened. If Alexis drew suspicion for being Brian's girlfriend, Clint Florence faced even more intense scrutiny for being the last person known to see Brian alive. Clint was with Brian that entire night. He was there when they bar hopped. He was there at the Ugly Tuna. And according to the timeline, he was one of the last people to see Brian before he vanished. That proximity made Clint both an invaluable witness and an inevitable suspect. Clint's account of that night has remained consistent across 18 years. He and Brian met up around 9 p.m. They went to a few bars in the area, having drinks, talking, watching the crowds. They ended up at the Ugly Tuna Saloon around 1:15 a.m. The bar was packed. They ordered drinks. They socialized separately, the way friends do in crowded bars. Clint said he last saw Brian around 1:55 a.m., talking to some women near the entrance. When the bar started closing and Clint couldn't find Brian, he assumed his friend had left, maybe met someone, maybe just decided to go home. Clint went home himself around 2 a.m. He didn't think anything was wrong. Why would he? People split up at bars constantly. He figured he'd talk to Brian the next day. But when Brian never came home, when he didn't show up to planned events, when his phone went unanswered, Clint realized something was very wrong. He contacted police. He cooperated fully. And then he found himself under investigation for his friend's disappearance. The scrutiny was intense. Police interviewed Clint multiple times, asking the same questions in different ways, looking for inconsistencies. Where exactly did you last see Brian? What was he wearing? How drunk was he? Did he seem upset about anything? Did you fight? Did anything unusual happen? Clint answered everything. His story never changed in any significant way. He was at the bar with Brian. They separated. He left. He assumed Brian did too. That's all he knew. But to investigators, Clint's position was uniquely suspicious. He was the last known person with Brian. If something happened to Brian, Clint would have been present for it or immediately after it. The fact that Clint seemed so unconcerned when he couldn't find Brian at closing time struck some as odd. Wouldn't you be more worried about your friend? Wouldn't you search harder? Wouldn't you stick around to make sure he got home safely? Clint's response to these questions was simple. It was a college bar on a Friday night. People wandered off all the time. Brian was a grown man capable of taking care of himself. There was nothing about that night that seemed unusual or dangerous until Brian failed to turn up the next day. With hindsight, yes, Clint wished he'd looked harder. But in the moment, he had no reason to think anything was wrong. Police administered a polygraph test. Clint passed, showing no deception when asked if he knew what happened to Brian or if he'd been involved in his disappearance. Polygraphs aren't admissible in court and aren't foolproof, but investigators generally trust them as an investigative tool. Clint's clean result suggested he was telling the truth. Or at least that he believed he was telling the truth. Despite the polygraph, suspicion lingered in some quarters. People dissected Clint's behavior in the days and weeks after Brian vanished. He seemed sad but functional. He cooperated with police but also got on with his life. He spoke to media but seemed guarded. To skeptics, everything looked potentially suspicious. To others, it looked like a young man dealing with a traumatic situation as best he could. One detail that raised eyebrows was Clint's later refusal to take additional polygraph tests requested by Brian's father, Randy. Randy hired private investigators and wanted Clint to undergo more extensive questioning. Clint declined, reportedly on the advice of an attorney. To some, this refusal suggested guilt. Why wouldn't an innocent person submit to any test that might help find their friend? But others pointed out that Clint had already cooperated extensively with police, had already passed one polygraph, and had every right to protect himself legally when suspicion was being directed at him unfairly. The relationship between Clint and Randy Schaefer deteriorated significantly. Randy made it clear he believed Clint knew more than he was saying. Not necessarily that Clint had harmed Brian, but that something happened that night that Clint wasn't revealing. This tension played out in public to some degree, with Randy making statements that increased pressure on Clint, and Clint retreating further from public engagement with the case. From an outside perspective, Clint's situation seems impossibly difficult. He lost a friend to mysterious circumstances. He cooperated with authorities. He passed investigative scrutiny. And yet he remains under a cloud of suspicion nearly 2 decades later simply because he happened to be present. He can't prove he doesn't know what happened to Brian any more than he already has. The absence of evidence in his favor isn't evidence against him, but in the court of public opinion, the distinction doesn't always matter. What do we actually know about Clint Florence's involvement? We know he was with Brian that night. We know he was captured on security footage leaving the bar alone around 2 a.m. We know his statements to police have been consistent. We know he passed a polygraph. We know there's no physical evidence connecting him to Brian's disappearance. We know that his account of the evening matches what security footage shows. What we don't know is whether Clint saw or heard something that night that seemed inconsequential at the time but might have been important. Maybe Brian mentioned going somewhere. Maybe someone was paying too much attention to Brian. Maybe there was an interaction Clint dismissed but that held significance. It's possible Clint knows something without knowing he knows it. But that's very different from being involved in or responsible for what happened. The tragedy for Clint Florence is that his proximity to Brian's disappearance has defined his life in ways he couldn't have anticipated. He was a friend spending a normal Friday night out, and it became the night that would haunt him forever. Whether he's treated fairly by public opinion is debatable. Whether he deserves suspicion based on available evidence is not. The evidence suggests he's exactly what he appears to be. A friend who was there when something inexplicable happened, and who has had to live with that coincidence ever since. Randy Schaefer's response to his son's disappearance was everything you'd expect from a loving father and more. He threw himself into finding Brian with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Every lead was pursued. Every theory was considered. Every psychic claim was investigated. Randy wasn't going to let his son be forgotten, and he wasn't going to accept that Brian was simply gone without answers. In the immediate aftermath, Randy was everywhere. Media interviews, press conferences, working with police, distributing flyers. His message was consistent: Brian wouldn't just leave. Something happened to him. Someone knew something. And Randy was determined to find out what. His visible grief and desperate determination made him a compelling figure in the media coverage of the case. But as weeks turned into months and months into years, Randy's crusade began to take a toll. He hired multiple private investigators, each promising they could find answers the police couldn't. He spent thousands of dollars on searches, on rewards for information, on psychics who claimed they could locate Brian. Some of these efforts seemed reasonable. Others ventured into territory that concerned people close to him. Randy became particularly focused on the people closest to Brian. He questioned Alexis's account of events. He doubted Clint's version of the night. He believed that someone in Brian's inner circle knew more than they were saying, and if he just pushed hard enough, asked the right questions, offered the right incentive, the truth would emerge. This conviction put him at odds with both Alexis and Clint, relationships that deteriorated as Randy's suspicions grew. The tension between Randy and Alexis became particularly painful. Here were two people who both loved Brian, both wanted answers, but who found themselves on opposite sides of a divide. Randy saw Alexis as evasive. Alexis saw Randy as accusatory. The distance between them grew until they were barely speaking, and eventually not speaking at all. It was a secondary tragedy layered on top of Brian's disappearance. Randy's relationship with Clint followed a similar pattern. Initially, Randy was grateful for Clint's cooperation and presence that night. But as time passed and no answers emerged, Randy began to question everything about Clint's account. Why didn't he look harder for Brian? Why did he leave the bar? Why did he seem so calm? Why wouldn't he take additional polygraph tests? Randy wanted Clint to do more, to say more, to somehow provide the key that would unlock the mystery. The toll on Randy's own life was severe. He struggled to work. His health declined. His world contracted to a single focus: finding Brian. Friends and family worried about him, worried that the search was consuming him in ways that weren't healthy. But Randy couldn't stop. To stop searching would feel like abandoning his son. And he'd already lost his wife. He couldn't lose Brian too without exhausting every possibility. Randy's faith that Brian was alive somewhere sustained him through the early years. He convinced himself that one day, Brian would call or walk through the door. That this would all have some explanation that made sense. That it wasn't an ending but just a really difficult chapter. As long as there was no body, there was hope. And Randy clung to that hope with everything he had. Tragically, Randy Schaefer died in September 2008, just 2.5 years after Brian's disappearance. He died never knowing what happened to his son. His final years were consumed by grief, by unanswered questions, by a search that yielded nothing concrete. The case remained exactly as mysterious the day Randy died as it had been the day Brian vanished. It was a heartbreaking end to a father's crusade. Randy's death meant that the person most invested in finding Brian, the person driving much of the investigative effort, was gone. The case didn't close, but it lost its most passionate advocate. Police continued to follow leads as they emerged, but without Randy's constant pressure, without his willingness to fund private investigators and pursue every possibility, the momentum slowed significantly. Looking back at Randy's efforts, it's hard not to feel immense sympathy. He did everything a father could do. He spent his final years fighting for answers. And he died without getting them. Whether his suspicions about Alexis and Clint were justified or whether they were the product of grief-fueled desperation looking for someone to blame, we may never know. But his commitment to finding Brian was absolute. Randy's story is a reminder of how unsolved cases affect families. The not knowing is torture. The absence of answers prevents closure. You can't grieve properly because there's always the possibility, however remote, that your loved one might still be alive. Randy existed in that limbo for 2.5 years. Every day waking up wondering if today would be the day he'd get news. Every phone call carrying the possibility of breakthrough or heartbreak. His crusade also highlights the dangers of becoming too invested in theories without evidence. Randy's suspicions about people close to Brian strained relationships and created conflicts that didn't serve the investigation. It's understandable. When conventional approaches fail, you start looking for unconventional answers. But sometimes the search for someone to blame becomes destructive in its own way. Randy Schaefer died still believing his son was out there somewhere. Still believing his son was out there somewhere. Still believing that answers existed. Still hoping that one day, the mystery would be solved. That faith, maintained in the face of overwhelming evidence that Brian was most likely dead, is both heartbreaking and admirable. It was a father's love manifested as unwavering hope. And even though he never got the answers he sought, his determination ensured that Brian's case stayed alive, that people kept looking, that his son wasn't forgotten. Let's return to the central mystery that makes Brian Schaefer's case so uniquely frustrating. The Ugly Tuna Saloon was located on the second floor of the South Campus Gateway complex. To enter the bar, you took an escalator up from the ground floor. That escalator area was covered by security cameras. To leave the bar, you took the same escalator down. Those cameras recorded continuously throughout the night of March 31, 2006. Investigators have confirmed that Brian appears on camera entering the bar at 1:15 a.m. The footage is clear.